Let's face it, an offensive mage cannot keep up with the speed of an assassin. The overlord began to move even faster, and with his speed and skill with his blades, he was able to inflict many wounds on Mr. Song, causing him to start bleeding. The healer did not have time to heal everything. If it had been anyone else, Mr. Song would have had a chance to win, but the warden's rank outnumbered him several times over. I was with Jin Ho and watched the battle. And when we saw Mr. Song bow his head after his wounds, we knew that he realized it was all useless. After all, the warder was already standing beside him, ready to kill him painlessly. But Mr. Song had planned all this in advance and was not ready to give up so easily. He put his hand on the ground and was able to use his fire magic. The overlord found himself in a ring of fire. Mr. Song hoped it would work, but it wasn't that simple, for the warden was already behind him and began to say that he was a mage pretending to be a swordsman to hide his magical abilities. And unleashing all his magical power at the right moment is not a bad plan, you sly old fox, but that would be the end of it. And Mr. Song was already ready to say goodbye to his life, as the warden had already raised his hand and was ready to deliver the final blow. But suddenly I decided to intervene, because I couldn't just stand by and watch my friend die in front of me. I blocked his blow, causing his arm and the dagger to fly away. The warden was shocked at where I had come from and didn't understand how I had been able to block his blow. The warden began to ask me who I was and what my rank was, and I told him that my name was Jin Woo and I was Irang. After that, the warden bounced back and couldn't believe his ears. After all, there was no way that someone who could fend off his attacks and be as fast as him was just an Irang. At this time, Mr. Song was able to get to his feet and did not understand how I managed to do it, but the warden was surprised and began to tell me that if I was a power type, then releasing such power would have been possible even for an Irang. However, looking at my speed and reaction time, it wasn't that easy. After all, I was able to block his attacks twice, and it turns out that my class is an assassin. Not only that, but it looks like I was hiding my true power, doesn't it? And even if you're a false ranger, you're not, because your friends seem to have known you for a long time. And that's impossible, because a pseudo-ranger wouldn't allow someone who sought his real power to survive. And there is only one answer here: you are an over-awakened one. After these words, Warden Jin Face and Mr. Song were surprised, for they had no idea that Jin Woo had been reawakened. The overseer went on to say that judging by my friend's reactions, you had recently awakened, and come to think of it, my guild boss had recently checked on someone because he thought he had awakened. And I think it was you. Anyway, it looks like you're an inexperienced hunter, in which case the warden should teach me a lesson. When the warden finished talking and threatening me, I decided to ask him why he did all this. And it wasn't just about the prisoners, because maybe they deserved all this. But why did you kill all the other hunters? The warden looked at me and saw that I was angry beyond belief. My face became very frightened, which made him smile strangely. And I say that, to be honest, he only did it for fun. And a little bit earlier, the old man who had offered the warden the job had told him that night that he'd heard that whatever happens in the dungeon stays there, and nobody else knows about it. Then he gave him a big bag with a lot of money in it for the work to be done. The old man began to plead with the jailers that he should kill all those responsible for the horrible crime. But the warden began to say that to do this he would have to pay an additional 10 billion for all the other criminals. If the old man could do it, the deal would go through. However, the jailer wondered why he would want to do this. But the old man began to say, when you go outside and see trash, you feel uncomfortable, but you don't clean it up. The warden didn't understand why he had to do all this. But the old man began to say that one of the inmates had harmed his daughter, causing her to take her own life, and her mother was still in the hospital from shock. I think about how the animals would walk free. Only a few years after the incident, he still can't sleep at night because of his actions. Eventually, the warden said he understood and was willing to provide a service worthy of 30 billion won. So the old man doesn't have to worry about it. Eventually, the warden began to explain to me that he just couldn't say no to the father whose daughter had been beaten by these criminals, and he tried to get him to change his mind by raising the price. But he accepted it anyway. Even though it turned out that way, the warden didn't want to hurt all the other guys. If they agreed not to talk about today's incident, he'd let them go. But I didn't think he would say that. But from the look on his face, he still wants to teach us a lesson and show us who's the best here. After all, I didn't believe him from the beginning, and there's no reason to trust someone who recently made up a story about our deaths. The moment the warden began to approach me, we got into a fight. I was able to parry his blow, and when he was next to me, he started saying that whether I believed me or not didn't matter anymore. He would be sorry that all of you would have to die with these insects, but I told him that he was too damn pathetic. At first the warden didn't understand what I was telling him, but right after that I told him that he was definitely going to die today. After I said that, the warden started smiling strangely, and he didn't know how high rank I had gotten since I was E rank. But now I shouldn't think it would be so easy. And so we began the battle, and when I swung, he walked away from my strike. It was like he evaporated. I looked at him and all I could see was his head flickering around me. I thought I could finish him off with one punch, but it turned out he was pretty fast. I underestimated him, and Mr. Song was watching us, and his eyes couldn't keep up with our speed. He couldn't understand how we could move at that speed. Mr. Sleep looked at me and realized that I wasn't the same guy I used to be, not the guy he'd known a month ago. At the same time I was fighting with this warden, and during the battle he started telling me that 30 billion won wouldn't be enough for a job like this. And who would have thought that I would meet a hunter of that level here? After all, we have the same speed. The wardens began. They asked me what my speed limit was, and even if my eyes could follow me, it was useless if your body couldn't handle it. But at that point Mrs. G put a speed boost on me, and I was able to move even faster. And at that moment the warden realized that the game seemed to be over, and we had to get serious. 12. We started fighting even harder, and everything in that cave was flying in different directions because we were moving so fast. My friends were standing behind us, even though they knew we were fighting equally, they couldn't even keep up with our speed. They just watched as the pile of stones and dust rose in the air, and the sounds of our blades were heard throughout the cave. Mr. Song and Mrs. G had never seen such a battle before, as if two monsters had begun to destroy everything near them. During the battle, the overseer began to say that even if we had the same speed and ability, and the difference in experience was too great, the difference would lead to my defeat. If I am going to defend my healer, I have to do it right. At that moment, he launched one of his blades directly at the healer. I turned around and realized that I wouldn't have time to move in time to protect her. But at that moment, Mr. Song got in front of the healer and was able to fight that blade off with his ball. I breathed a sigh of relief, for nothing threatened the healer. At that very moment, however, the healer began to attack me with all his might. He was cutting me with his knees, but I adopted a blocker pose and thought he could not inflict serious wounds on me. Although there were wounds, they were non-critical, and I was still on my feet. When the warden stopped attacking me, were surprised that I was quite resilient. I stood in the same spot and began to feel my bloodlust begin to break through. She was sensitive to the urge to kill, and I got an emergency assignment from the system again, because my system was activated again because of it. The purpose of the assignment was to kill the players who intended to kill me to ensure my safety. If the assignment was not completed, my heart would stop. And now I realized that I had no choice but to kill that overseer. For if I didn't, I risked losing my life. I was ready to act and go right at him. The warden noticed that I looked different already, but he still thought the advantage was on his side. I was grateful that the system was giving me another reason to finish this guy off, and at that moment I shifted and started attacking the overlord with speed. We skirmished in combat, but the warden began to tell me that my class, which specializes in daggers and agility, kills mostly in close combat. Am I not a better opponent for you? He asked me, but I thought differently. And here's the fact that I certainly learned a lot from him, including the fact that a guy talking gives away such uselessness. And at the same moment I activated my sprint skill and my movement speed increased by 30% and my mana consumption decreased to 1 unit every minute. I was much faster than before. And at that very moment, the warden became nervous, because he hadn't expected this turn of events. And when I was able to pass the state defense, he was stunned, because he realized that I was also using my skills. Eventually, I was able to hit the warden and gave him a scratch with my dagger. At the same moment, the warder began to feel terrible pain on his face, as my paralysis effect had been activated. I also activated the bleeding effect. From now on, he will lose 1% of his health per second. The warden stammered as he realized that it was poison acting directly on him. But after a moment he realized that my dagger was poisoned, and I could cast effects with the poison I had learned to use in my dagger. However, the warden was not such an easy opponent, and he began to resist my effect because of his high resistance. My effect was cancelled at the same moment, and I looked at him with surprise, because my action stops quickly if my opponent is strong. The overseer also began to show me that she had something interesting in mind. I watched to see what he wanted to show me, and I saw the warden begin to disappear from where he was standing. And after an update, he completely disappeared. That's what I didn't expect. I couldn't figure out what had happened. It was as if he had evaporated before my eyes. But suddenly I felt someone want to hit me. I was able to block his blow with my intuition. And at that same moment, I began to hear a voice beside me begin to tell me that I had indeed blocked it. So even though he was hiding his presence, and considering that you have great instincts, that deserves praise, the Overlord was able to erase his appearance, his scent, his sound, and even his aura, and only a few will be able to kill using this rare skill. At first it was said that no one yet knew that he had this ability, but there are those who have seen him use it. No one yet has survived. Suddenly I felt a pain in my legs, and when I put my head down, I saw blood starting to flow from my legs. I knew at once that he, being invisible, had managed to cut my tendons in my legs. My wounds could be healed quickly, but only basic healing spells work at this distance. And when the healer wanted to help me, the warden appeared and pointed his blade at her, saying, "Don't try anything, I'll come for you when it's your turn, Mr. Song." I realized that if nothing was done, there would be no endurance left of Mr. Jin Woo, and he could not call for help now, help me with his skills, but must buy some time for his healing. At the same moment it appeared that I would not be able to stand up to him in this state, and at least my speed would definitely not be the same as before. After all, it would take a long time to heal such wounds. But I told him to shut his mouth, for he talks too much. Yes, this battle was getting to me completely fed up, and at this point I decided that it was time to call it a day. I activated my status recovery skill, and at that moment I began to heal all my wounds. Mr. Song and Mrs. Jin Ho couldn't believe their eyes, and neither could the warden. After all, I was instantly healed. The warden couldn't understand and began to think that maybe he wasn't a killer hunter, because everything looked like cheating. You can't be sure that a hunter with the recovery ability even exists. But I, for my part, realized that because of certain limitations, it didn't make sense to rely on that alone. Come to think of it, there are other options. But the warden thought it was a trick, or perhaps a feigned confidence, and he wondered how many times I could use this ability. It was hard for him to tell, but to him I was very dangerous at this point. But I have full confidence in myself now. I realized again that one of my senses was dead in me, and the likes of him were not even worthy of my wrath. After all, I stand several stories above him in strength, agility, and speed. And so I began to act. I approached the warden directly and swung, but I didn't hit him. Although I was very close, the warden immediately realized that I saw him again through the camouflage, and I aimed straight at his neck without any hesitation. It was all clear to the warden now, for he had finally seen the real difference between me and him. The warden guessed that I had committed murders before, and you and I weren't so different. There are many ways to live and die, and his determination to change his fate, even at the cost of his life, eventually forced him to make hard decisions quickly. The changes of the past 2 months were not only external, for it was the awakening and an unexpected force that changed the rules of society. New exclusive rules have been created just for hunters, and there is no need to be constrained by law or morality, for the words of the strong are law. At that moment, the Overlord decided to show me his true power and lunged at me, but I was ready for it and stayed where I was. He started attacking me from all sides, but I stood and parried. The warden seemed to understand how I saw him through the camouflage. When the camouflage is activated, it hides his presence. But when he attacks with a strong lust for killing, for a moment his presence is revealed. That's exactly what he's waiting for, and he has no other way of knowing where I'm attacking from. And he must stop it. Such thoughts were the only ones that visited the warden. I didn't care what that warden thought or guessed, for my killing lust skill had been activated. The Overlord had fallen into my trap, and now he wasn't going anywhere. For my trap had already worked, and my terrible shadow was already consuming him, and he didn't realize what was happening. But when he lifted his head, he saw something ominous in front of him, staring straight into his soul. It was my darkness that clouded his eyes. My shadow began to recede little by little, and now the warden no longer knew what to do or how to get out of this terrifying trap. I decided to deliver one last controlling blow right into his heart, and my dagger plunged into him. He, in turn, didn't even realize what had happened. But I was already standing in front of him, ready for the next step. He who fights with monsters must be careful not to become a monster himself. And if you look long into the abyss also looks into you. For in the course of his life, the hunter witnesses countless deaths and takes his own life. Often there are situations in which the hunter finds himself between life and death, and in such moments he fights not only against monsters, but also against other hunters. We become the perfect killing machines, but you, as an ordinary person, do not fall into that category. I'm going to die because I lost, and that's natural. The warden decided to ask me only one question: who am I really? An assassin with recovery magic and skills that impose a negative effect. After all, he'd never heard of anything like that, but I wasn't entirely sure myself, either. The warden went on to say that although his words meant nothing to me, having a bunch of secrets wasn't so great. At this point, my paralysis effect activated, as well as the bleeding effect. The overlord began to bleed even more, his body no longer listening to him. After I killed him, I could no longer hide my abilities, but I began to tell him that let's pretend I was a hunter, getting stronger with every battle, and how strong he thought I could become. The overseer began to smile and said that my shadow was merging with the darkness, and I would become as strong as my shadow would sink into the darkness. At this point, the task was completed, and I was able to complete the emergency task by killing the enemy. As a reward, I was asked to choose one of the rewards shown. Although I stopped much stronger than before, for the same reason I can feel something change in me. As I get stronger, at this point my thoughts were interrupted by Jin Woo, who was standing behind me. She thanked me for saving her. After all, thanks to me, they would be dead by now if I hadn't been here. But now we have to decide what to do next, and I guess we should go out and tell the guilds what happened. That's what Mr. Song told me. I told him that we should close the dungeon first, but Mr. Song asked me, "Aren't you going to go out and kill the boss by yourself?" Even though he saw my skills, he won't try to stop me this time. After all, he wants to bury his friends properly now. I walked over to the warden to retrieve my blade, and suddenly a notification appeared in front of me that I had received a new invisibility rune. And then I realized that I could get his ability by killing him. Mr. Song began to say that he and Jiho Monthly would go first and inform the guild, but I had to hurry. After all, they will be waiting for me outside. I replied to tell them not to worry, for it wouldn't take long. And when they had gone, I went over to those prisoners who were lying on the ground and began to say, "I know he is alive, and you will have to get up." I began to question the prisoner about why he was trying to pretend to be dead and about his attempt to escape unnoticed. However, when he was lifted up, I noticed that his throat had been cut and he could not speak. It was pretty brutal, since his vocal cords had been cut. He was probably going to kill his victims in the most excruciating way possible after they were unable to scream. He was dying of blood loss, but if we ask Miss Gihu, he could probably survive. The prisoner thought he was saved, but I began to pull him in the other direction. However, as soon as the prisoner realized that this was not the way out, he began twitching in different directions. Soon we came to the door, which was the entrance to the boss's room. The prisoner's eyes bulged when he saw that it was the boss's room, and there was a mighty, huge man standing in front of him. I started asking the prisoner questions because I wanted to know if he remembered the faces of all his victims. I knew he was as trash as the warden, and whether he thought I would let a monster like him out. Immediately after my words, all the goblins behind him began to pounce on him and tear him to pieces with their big, green paws. They pounced on him like a herd of horrible monsters, for monsters know nothing else but to pounce on their prey in a group and tear it to pieces. Silent cries spread everywhere after that. You were able to defeat the boss and defeat the goblin right after that. It wasn't that hard for me, and after leaving the dungeon, Mr. Song and Miss Jui explained to the guild employee what had happened. The employee truly realized the magnitude of what had happened and rushed to contact his superiors. It didn't take long for the elite to arrive, and soon after, they drove over and unhitched all the buildings near us. As soon as they got out of the car, the two guys started asking questions. "How long has it been since we left the dungeon?" one of them asked. The girl replied that it had been about 40 minutes and only 20 minutes left. It's been too long, and all the employees who were here need to try to save the bodies of the victims in 8 minutes. If that doesn't work, someone needs to leave them there and come back. The guy continued to ask questions. Did those survivors clean up the dungeon themselves? The girl confirmed that they did. Then the guy who arrived realized that the warden had tried to kill the other hunters while performing a contract killing. If this was true, then he had deliberately arranged the corpses and closed the dungeon because he had something to hide. But suddenly this guy saw me, and he was surprised. He realized that he was the hunter's son Jin Woo. At first he didn't recognize me. He asked me, "Finally we meet again. I realized he was one of the supervisory officers. The guy introduced himself and said his name was Jin Woo, and he was the head of the oversight department. He seemed to think that one of his employees had inconvenienced us, and they would give us their unofficial apology after the case was solved and the investigating committee would handle the case in their place. And then I realized that there was no time to relax, just because I had killed a hunter, and even though I hadn't noticed it before. Well, looking at the head of supervision, I realized that he is strong and on a completely different level, and I can't handle him at my current strength. However, the head of oversight began to say that as a member of the oversight department he had some questions he wanted to ask us and things would go smoothly if we cooperated with them. I replied that I understood, and he decided to ask us directly, who killed the high-ranking overseer? After these words, I thought to myself that it seemed impossible to hide the fact that I was overworked now, and I would probably have to terminate my contract with Jin Woo. And since he wanted a talented but not yet too experienced hunter, all would be lost. But suddenly Mr. Song answered the supervisor's question and said that it was he who killed the supervisor alone. The head then asked if he didn't mind, he should name his rank. Mr. Song said that he was of rank 0. The head did not understand how from rank 0 he could defeat a high-ranked hunter, but Mr. Song began to say that he could not see who was behind him. The chapter saw that with the healer's support and rank, they were probably able to defeat him. But the overseer was one of those who could not be controlled even within the department. Could he, with his one-armed rank, truly defeat a dangerous assassin in battle? He asked to go through them with him, for he was afraid he would need our help in filing a few reports. But a little later I stepped back with Mr. Song and asked him why he lied. He replied that he had just assumed that I had a good reason for hiding my abilities and that I shouldn't have done it. Yes, and I can't avoid an investigation anyway, and Mr. Song can't pay me for everything I've done for him. But right now that's all he can offer me. After that, the head began to ask me that he didn't think he could be overpowered by a hunter like me before, like the warden. And he also thinks that there is no reason to suspect me of overshadowing again. However, he decided to tell me something that he advised me to be more careful in the future, otherwise my life might soon be cut short. But I didn't understand what that meant. But the head went on to say that when Hwang Dong-suk's group was destroyed, only 2 people survived, me and another guy. And the problem is that Hwang Dong-suk had a younger brother who could take revenge on us. And then I realized that he was talking about a hunter who was in S rank. And it doesn't matter what really happened in the raid. What matters is that I survived, and since he is in S rank, the law is unlikely to stop him. They are living wonders and a disaster at the same time. And it's in my best interest to keep an eye on him, because we may be hunted by someone who even monsters fear. The head went on to say that if it were possible, my beloved and I could leave the country. That would not be a bad idea. However, 3 hours after the investigation into the warden's murder began, the general manager of the gold business turned himself in, confirming the investigation data. After that, Chun-hee asked me if I remembered the magic crystal I gave her in that double dungeon. That same evening we agreed to go for a walk, for we were just on our way home. I followed Jenny, and I noticed that she seemed uncomfortable being with me, and she began to ask me that I had changed a lot lately. But she hadn't changed a bit since then, even though she'd been through a lot. I told her that everyone changes in their own way, and though I was right, she began to say that I should know that she was too buried to be a hunter. And she's trying to overcome her fears, but it's not easy. After all, if you're a healer of rank, it's okay to go on raids, either of rank or at least from rank, if you're ill-prepared. But it still only joins raids of D or E rank, and that's where she kept meeting me, continuing to heal wounds that wouldn't stop showing up on me. And, to be honest, it even began to annoy her, because she thought I was stupid and vain at times. I always managed to survive. Because I saw your eyes full of life, and they seemed to be screaming for survival and to see tomorrow. Junhee never thought she would ever have eyes like that. And I promised her that we would have lunch together when we came back alive. When she held out her hand to me, there was a magic crystal in it. She said she had to give it back to me. I noticed that she started talking about how she was going to leave and go back to her hometown of Busan. She said that if I was in that city, I should definitely call her and she would treat me to sushi. But I tried to hold back and not show too much enthusiasm. I held this magic crystal in my hand and told her that if I ever found myself in the neighborhood, I would ask her to walk with me again. She was very happy to hear this, and soon she waved me off and left. I stood alone that evening and wondered what I should do next, for I had just gained another reason to become stronger. After all, S-rank hunter Huang Dongsu is hunting me, and I need to become stronger as quickly as possible. That's the only way I can survive and fight back against anyone who tries to take my life. When I got home, I went to bed. The next morning I went to one of the places Jin Ho had told me to go. However, when I was already there, I didn't understand who all these people who had gathered here were. Jin Ho asked me what I meant. After all these people are our partners for the day, and those who have a hunter's license can't participate in raids for various reasons. They are injured or alcoholic. And then there are those who, for various reasons, continue to fight for life, and they have been assembled on our team. And there are also those who came here to make a quick buck. I wondered if even children were allowed into heaven. I asked Jin Ho, but he said that if it was a waking child, there was no law against them going. The girl who overheard our conversation heard what we said about her, and it was rude as she replied that she was a full-fledged hunter. I started asking her questions, since she was a high school girl, and asked if she had any experience in raids. She said no, but I told her it was okay, because they wouldn't have to follow us. They would just have to wait outside and only Jin Ho and I would go inside. Jin Ho started saying that we couldn't go into the dungeon just the two of us. That's why we took you guys with us. And the law requires at least 10 participants for the dungeon. Those guys who were standing there watching all of this were reflecting on the fact that we are really very strong. Since the two of us decided to go there, they were glad. And they were glad that we were really going to give them 3 million each, even if they stayed outside. Jin Ho started saying that 3 million for a raid to each of them was a hell of a deal, considering they wouldn't have to lift a finger, and all they had to do was wait outside for us until we were done. However, they must not tell anyone about what they see or hear here. If anyone blabbers, they have to pay 10 times what they make today. It's written in the contract they signed. But as soon as we started moving out, I saw something and started saying to Jin Ho, I was wondering, what the hell is he so degenerate about? But he started to answer, what is this? A complete set of hardened armor created in an Italian craftsman's jewel. If the two of us were going on a raid, shouldn't he have been fully prepared? But I decided to check something out, and when I approached him, I shoved him with one finger. And after that, like a big log, he fell to the ground, so he couldn't move in his suit. I decided to ask him to just take it off. When he tried to get up, it didn't work, so he asked me to help him. I set him down, and as he took off that stupid armor and helmet, he started talking. But because of his nervousness, he kept the stupid helmet to somehow secure his head. I mean, he took that helmet just in case, but it didn't matter to me anymore. And we just had to hurry up and get it over with. And just as we started going into the portal, those guys that were behind us started whispering amongst themselves that we were going into the dungeon alone. And what was even sillier was that we didn't look strong. One of those guys started saying that if he wasn't strong enough to defend the dungeon on his own, he wouldn't be better off mopping up a high-ranked dungeon with big monsters. And that if they even died, but we got our money's worth. And suddenly one of the guys started telling the other guys that he had once heard this name, Jin Woo, and he was known as the world's weakest hunter, or rather, that was his nickname. And eventually these guys decided that we were just seeing each other, because youth bullying causes a lot of trouble for others. And a few hours later, Jin Ho ran out of the dungeon. Those guys waiting outside were surprised that he came back alive and thought he had just run away. But the other guy turned around and what he saw made him realize that it didn't look like Jin Ho had escaped. He told all the guys to turn around and look at it, because the gate was starting to close. And then they realized that we had killed the boss after all. When I got out, I asked Jin Ho, where do we go next? And Jin Ho replied that the next raid was about 1 o'clock away. Jin Ho started yelling to everyone else to get ready. After all, we're starting to move out, and we've got 3 more dungeons to clear today. Although those guys were shocked by what they saw, we figured they'd go, considering it's an easy 9 million for each of them. That high school girl who was standing behind us was surprised that we were going back to the dungeon after cleaning it up. She began to wonder who we really were. That same day at the White Tiger Guild, one of the guys brought a report and asked another to take a look at it. It said that 200,500,000 someone had actually spent that amount to get the rights to sweep the dungeon from the ranks. Recently there was a team, so now there are no gates left for hunters. It was originally 1,000, but even when they raised the price to 100 million, they bought back the rights for 200,500,000. This report made one of the guild staffers go into total shock. They began to read the report and saw that the leader of the group's name was Jin Ho and they had never heard of him. They soon realized that he was the second son of Eugene's CEO, and it looks like they bought the rights with the support of the company. But after all, it's a big loss for them, and isn't that too risky an outing for a future CEO? But suddenly a memory came to one of the guys that they had heard of a survivor of that incident in the Double Den about 2 or 3 months earlier, and his name was Jin Woo. It was already interesting, and that guy started screaming at everybody to drop what they were doing now. Hunter D ranked Jin Ho and E ranked Jin Woo. Find whatever you can to take these two guys out now. At the White Tiger Guild, one of the guys started typing quickly on the keyboard and searching for information, and discovered that Jin Woo had safely survived 3 accidents. The first mistake was the double murder. The second was the death of Hwang Dong-suk's group. The third was the recent murder of a supervising inspector. The two guys met during the second incident. The most interesting thing is how Jin Ho is connected to the Yojin company. Rumor has it that Chairman Manhwa is hiring experienced hunters and plans to start a guild. If this is true, it is not surprising that Jin Ho wants to profit from it. After all, recruiting experienced hunters and quickly clearing dungeons means that Jin Woo the hunter may wake up again. And of course, otherwise he wouldn't have had a chance of surviving those incidents. Each time it was a major incident with many victims, and there was no other explanation these guys saw in the last incident report. A mage with rank and a healer in rank worked together to stop the hunter watchman. But that was impossible, for he was a high-ranked assassin, and magic is almost useless against assassins. And he was clever, so the first thing he had to take care of was the target. In fact, it was supposed to be a mage versus assassin confrontation. Unless someone else defeated a hunter from the surveillance department, with the only survivors being the healer, the mage, and the hunter's son Jin Woo. And no one else. Among the survivors, only one person is suspicious. And now the White Tiger Guild must move out on a reconnaissance mission to find out for themselves, rather than seeking information from unreliable sources. One of my subordinates was shocked that the chief himself would go on a reconnaissance mission, although that is so rare. However, I was in the cave at the time, and there were 3 large wolfhounds in front of us. They were horrible monsters, but they weren't much of a threat to me. After all, I now had a very good skill with which I could disappear from sight. Because of this, those monsters began to shake with fear, because they felt the threat, but could not see it. They were confused and looking in different directions, and I began to act. In the blink of an eye, I had dispersed all the monsters that were near me, and they didn't just crumble into little pieces. But I got Jin Ho, who mined the magic crystals. Why have I been hiding this skill all this time? He looked at me and realized that I had gotten even stronger, but at the same time I looked at my characteristics and saw that my sprint skill had been upgraded, as well as my death strike skill. I was able to get my first level dagger skill as well. I realized that I had leveled up a bit and gained new skills that I got from that warden's corpse. The content of his skill confuses me, but it is much more effective than my other skills. The whole problem is the continuous mana consumption. I wasn't going to put points into intelligence, but it looks like I'll have to. I hesitated for a moment. I was looking at my stats, and at that moment another wolfhound appeared, rushing right at me and trying to overpower me. But at that very moment, I applied my passive and active skills, and my skillful dagger wielding, as well as my lethal strike, put a fat end to this battle with this wolfhound. At one point, using my skills, I discovered 3 errors in the text. I was glad, because it looked good. And at the same moment I was able to increase my level, but suddenly I saw a notification window with an attention badge. I realized that a certain level was still required, but I did not understand what it meant. In addition, I noticed that I was offered a task to change my profession. I had to make up my mind whether or not to accept this assignment, for the change of profession was important to me. But at this time, the head of the White Tiger arrived at the gate we had recently entered, and his face immediately changed after he saw that right in front of the gate a bunch of people were just sitting at a picnic and eating their food. It looked like a playground for little kids who were brought food and told to stay there. I didn't understand what was going on and why everyone was waiting outside the gate. But suddenly a high school girl came up to the head of the guild and said, "What are they doing here? Because this is the forbidden zone." But the head of the White Tiger Guild wondered, what kind of child is this? And told her not to meddle in adult matters. Besides, this gate area is not safe. However, she replied that she too is a hunter and should not be treated as a child. She is part of this raid, and though she was embarrassed to say so, that she is special, she did not even enter the dungeon with her partners. If the head's intuition doesn't deceive him, I'm definitely the recruit who showed up for the first time in a long time. But suddenly everyone started jumping up and saying that the raid leader was coming back, and everyone should be ready to move out. Jin Woo and I started to leave the portal, and I asked him what the schedule was for tomorrow, for I had forgotten that I had urgent things to do, and it was better not to plan anything for tomorrow. He said that he had already made reservations at the dungeon, but if it was urgent, he would cancel the reservation, and I would really have to cancel the reservation. After all, if we book the gate and don't go in within 2 days, the reservation is automatically cancelled. I thought about it and told him to put it off for a while. But suddenly I heard someone call my name, and when I looked up, I saw a man in front of me. He handed me his business card and said it was a pleasure to meet me. He is the head of the White Tiger Guild's second department. I was surprised because I had heard of the White Tiger Guild before. I wondered what he wanted from me. A while later we found ourselves at a nearby coffee shop and sat at a table talking. That guy started telling me about hunters, reapers, knights, and the words white tigers. I should have heard of them at least once, but instead I replied that of course I knew that the White Tiger Guild was one of the best guilds in South Korea. Then he cut to the chase and said that they wanted to invite me to join the White Tiger Guild and offer me twice the salary of Eugene Company. This White Tiger Guild guy decided that there was no point in stalling, because the true moment had arrived, and if I demonstrated my skills beyond expectations, the remuneration could be increased. I don't see how that can't be a generous offer for a hunter who was still an E-Ranger not too long ago. I decided to ask him how much it cost to build a building so he could offer me that. But this guy didn't know what that meant or why I was asking. Maybe I needed to clarify how much he was willing to increase his generosity. He began to say that they were using it to the tune of 50 billion. After that I asked him if he would really give it to me, but he didn't quite know what I was talking about. 30 billion! Shouted the head of the White Tiger Guild, and it made all the coffee houses go up in ears. He himself was quite frightened, so much so that he even jumped up from his chair. When he saw that everyone was looking at him, he quickly sat back down and pretended that he had accidentally shouted. I began to say that the amount Eugene offered for the straw was 30 billion won. If you offer twice that amount, that means you are offering your 50 billion won. At this point, the head wondered how great his abilities were if Eugene offered him 30 billion won. They had not yet checked his rank and did not know if he was bluffing, since there was no way to check his words. But I replied to him that if he thought I was bluffing, I could provide proof. And since he offered twice as much, I thought he had heard about my deal with Jin Woo. But that didn't seem to be the case, and the head of the White Tiger Guild began to say that it was not within his power to pay such a sum. If I could give him some time, he would discuss it with the guild leadership. After he said that, I said let's call it a day and started to get up from my chair. After that, the guy started getting nervous and wondering if he might be in too much of a hurry. If only he had known the details of Eugene's proposal, he would have gotten permission from the guild and acted in small but confident steps. But before I left I decided to ask him how he had obtained information about me and whether he had been watching my surroundings. And at that very moment the guild leader felt a cut on his face, which caused him to start bleeding. He realized that I was using invisibility, but I ordered him not to turn around. And after these words it became clear in my head that if I'm an overawakened person who can use invisibility, then the way out of this situation is obvious. And I began to say that he was digging for me on purpose, and he had been informed that someone was sweeping the dungeon too quickly, and they began to investigate the matter. They pushed on me, because 3 major incidents had happened in the dungeons, and he had no evidence. Inside the time, it's no longer a coincidence. And after I was reawakened, I got the abilities of a high-ranking hunter, which helped me get through all these incidents. Jin Woo must have seen my ability during the second raid, and when I got my father. And that's what I seem to be doing now. And all things considered, it all adds up, and they know what they know. After that I asked him how many people knew about it. And the head of the White Tiger Guild answered that it was just him and one of his subordinates, but at the time that subordinate was sitting outside wondering how the chief was doing. And that's when I realized that maybe mopping up the gate too quickly was drawing too much attention. I don't want the number of people who know about me to increase, and if rumors about me start to spread, you and your subordinates will be ready to answer for it. However, the head of the guild was obligated to report to his superiors, but he didn't want to die either. And then I told him that I would personally warn my subordinate. And at that moment I cancelled my spell and appeared right in front of him, beginning to talk about how we seem to have inconvenienced the White Tiger Guild by removing too many dungeons. Unfortunately, we're not going to stop yet. The head of the guild interrupted me and began explaining that this is exactly the problem. We are letting our newcomers out of the gate by training them, but we can't send them to higher ranked gates. Then I asked, how about a deal? We will sell 3 of our armor, and of course, this offer is only valid for today. If you don't take advantage of this opportunity, it will be difficult to book these gates later. The head asked me, am I really a gate buyer? Gates don't just appear in metropolitan cities, and they can train recruits in other provinces as well? The only problem is that it could cause conflicts between us and the other guilds. Eventually, the head replied that he agreed, and asked how much it would cost. I told him let's say 300 million for each dungeon. But after that, the guild leader got nervous and told me that for mana crystals and magic crystals from the dungeons they could get a maximum of 200 million, and buying at that price would take a big loss. He offered me 200 million won. And after that I said that I agree. And when we shook hands, I told him that 3 brothers for a total of 600 million, that he should transfer the money to my personal account. And finally, I told him that I had a gift for him. He had to open his mouth. And as soon as he opened it, I poured him a special liquid, which made his face disappear early, his head in the same turn. I did not understand what this ability was. Also, the wound on his face instantly healed. I got tired and started walking, and at the end I heard the head ask me about the fact that I had just shown him invisibility and healing abilities. He asked if that could be considered a sign of my trust. But I told him that if it meant that he would at least keep my secret, then yes. At the same moment I disappeared, but a subordinate of the head ran up and started asking him what kind of light it was and how it went with this guy. However, the head of the guild was in the sky and very nervous, because he realized that they had met a much scarier man than they thought. A little later I contacted Jin Woo, and he told me that the transfer was received 600 million, just as I had told him. Jin Woo was delighted because the cancelled raids had been sold for that amount. He asked his husband, was I able to sell them? But I answered him with a smile on my face that it was a trade secret. That same day, but a little later, his subordinate came running to the head and began to tell him that there were high-ranking gates left in their area. The head was completely shocked by this news. Oh, and all the prices were under 10 million. And then the head realized that maybe Jin Woo's team wasn't going to the raid today. And then the chapter got nervous because not only did he not get any information about Jin Woo, but he was also cheated. Could this mean that he did so out of fear that his identity might be revealed? But suddenly the chapter saw a message from an unknown number. The message said that it was Jin Woo, and with that I could turn a blind eye to the fact that he was digging into his past. At the same moment, after reading that message, the head realized that the deal was a front to get money, and he didn't think I would contact him. After all, I had sent a message to my business card number, but that wasn't bad either. After all, they got Jin Woo's number, and from now on the White Tiger Guild will have the main goal of getting this guy. After all, the money they spent today is not that much money for the White Tiger Guild, although he might still have problems with the higher-ups. That same evening I decided to proceed with my main goal for the near future. A gate appeared before me, which I myself had opened. After all, I decided right today to change my profession. Before it sounded interesting, I can't wait to find out what monsters will be inside, and finally this game started for real. And when I went inside the gate, there were knights waiting for me, who began to fight me as soon as I walked in. They were very strong, but slow at the same time. Because of this, I was able to dodge their attacks. It became difficult for me to fight him. I activated my special skill, Deathstroke. Now I am able to inflict critical damage to the enemy's vital points. At the same time, I also used the sprint skill, which increased my movement speed by 30%. For every minute I use this skill, 1 unit of mana is consumed. However, after all that, I realized that my attacks weren't doing him any damage at all. Although the opponent wasn't too strong, my dagger can't penetrate his armor, and his movements are predictable. His attacks are not strong enough, and his only advantage is defense. He does not use his skills, and perhaps he does not know how to attack effectively. The more he opens up with his movements, the harder I can strike. I already had experience battling similar opponents, but they were proving too tough for my dagger. I grabbed my opponent with my hands like a knight. Eventually I was able to tear off his iron head, and finally kill the knight. This type of monster was weak in long battles, and could you even call them monsters? Most likely a toy monster, and it would be a shame to have to fight only such guys in the future. Also, since I'm using a torch instead of a sacred stone, it's a little dark, just like the instant dungeon. I can't get out until I close it, and it wouldn't hurt to conserve mana. The most frustrating thing is that my health is not restored, and I can't leave this dungeon until I close it. Also, there is a ground restriction in this area, and my health will not regenerate the store as I increase. Although my invisibility and death strike were quite effective, they don't consume too much mana. If I had known this was going to be the case, I would have put some points into intelligence. A certain difficulty in the dungeon, the lack of ability to heal, and the inability to escape make this dungeon too risky. It's a career-changing assignment, it can't be graded. I don't know how many hours or even weeks it will take me to complete this quest, but the worst part is that I can't heal, and I remembered that I had already completed the daily quest today. I thought it would be quick and I could finish it all in one night. If it takes more than 12 hours, I could fall prey to centipedes like that time. I don't feel good, I'd better get a profession and do the daily assignment sooner. Besides, last time I ran away from them as hard as I could, but if I run into a centipede now, can I beat it? But first I'll have to take care of these big guys who rely only on their protection. When a mob of knights came after me, I threw my torch to the ground and started running straight at them, attacking them with my bare hands. After all, my dagger couldn't penetrate their defenses. I struck one of the knights. The result was a dent in his chest, and he flew off toward the other knights who were standing in the middle. However, I still had to deal with the two knights on my sides. I jumped up and started hitting them in the head. I was lucky that the knights were too slow and couldn't keep up with my movements. I could have just jumped and attacked them in midair, since their line of sight was limited because of that armor. Eventually I finally managed to defeat the last knight that stood in my way. I realized that if I couldn't cut them, I could just be where their bones should be. But even decent things fell off some of the knights. It's a money pouch and a breastplate above the knight. It was just wonderful that the elements of the armor could be hidden and not necessarily display their appearance. If anyone saw me, I would be a laughingstock. And I wondered if in reality he would protect me, too. I was also able to get gold from the pouch that fell out, and at this point I had as much as 863,400 gold coins. But suddenly I began to feel something strange, as if someone was approaching me. My instincts did not fail me. I drew my blade and thrust it into the air. However, it turned out that there was a knight using invisibility. I was horrified that there were monsters capable of becoming invisible. Also, there was some huge fireball flying at me, which I was able to turn away from. When I turned around, I saw a mage standing not far from me. He used fire magic and threw that orb of invisibility at me, the same kind of magic that Mr. Huang had used back then in the dungeon. But now I was concerned about the fact of what was going on here. After all, it looks like a repeat of battles that have already been fought. It turned out to be harder than I thought it would be. All the monsters are different types, so I have to use different characteristics to defeat each one. Knights require strength, archers require stamina, and mages require intelligence. If I didn't put enough points into strength, I wouldn't be able to break the armor of knights, and if my perception was lower, I would have problems with assassins. Since I didn't put points into intelligence, I'd have to save mana as much as possible and stop using skills altogether. Also, I'm starting to get tired. I have to finish as quickly as possible. The longer this goes on, the worse it is for me. I'll have to close my eyes for a while and get some rest to reduce the fatigue. But suddenly an arrow flew at me, which I caught right in front of my face. And when I looked up, I saw the archers standing not far from me. Luckily, it looked like they weren't going to give me a break. I was able to overpower them, and a little later I found another bag with 20,000 gold in it. There was also a bottle filled with warm water. I upgraded a bit and collected quite a few items. I also got some rest and thought I could move on to the next stage. However, the way I looked was ridiculous with that guard necklace, the breastplate above the knight, the archers and higher knights' gauntlets, and the assassin's boots. It all looked awful on me, but I was glad no one could see it. I was pretty much leveled up. And when I saw the big door in front of me, I wondered what skills the monster lurking behind that door had. After all, this was the boss's room, and that bone-chilling cold was coming right out from behind the door. When I opened the door, I saw that all the torches that were in this room were lit. I could hardly see anything in front of me, for there was some kind of strange fog. But eventually I could see that it was the royal throne room. I began to hear some footsteps, as if someone was approaching me from the darkness, and my vision, hearing, and fingertips began to give me signals. I realized that I remembered the feeling. It was the same as in the double dungeon. This coldness I realized seemed to emanate from this guy who was coming toward me. After feeling that way, I doubted whether I could beat him. And what should I even do? After all, my fatigue had more or less calmed down, but it wouldn't be for long if this battle dragged on with him. This huge knight began to emerge from the wall. He looked terrifying in his bloody armor. It was the blood-red warlord Igris. I saw a dark red name that was definitely different from the others. It was a knight defending the empty throne of Igris. It did not take him long to attack me. He swung his great sword, but I managed to duck in time, and he missed. Soon after that, total destruction began, as he cleaved through the pillars like air. To me, this guy turned out to be an insanely strong knight. He was also impenetrable, as my blade didn't even leave a scratch on his armor. I didn't expect her to attack me instantly in response to what I was trying to do to her. She swung her big sword and struck with all her might, making the ground beneath us shake. But I managed to jump away, and now I was flying through the air. Suddenly I saw something red moving right toward me, and smoke began to rise from underneath it. It was already too close, right next to my face, and luck was on my side. I was able to dodge after all, and his blow hit the nearest column that was behind me, and it started to collapse. And as soon as the column collapsed, I was able to jump off the back of it and look right at his back. It was hard for me to breathe because the fight didn't stop for a second. Also, my armor speed reduction effect only works if my strength is below 80. This guy's strength is definitely above 70. His destructive power far exceeds mine, and his agility also prevents my dagger from penetrating his armor. That means his defense is higher than mine. If there is any way to defeat him, I realize that he is even stronger than I could have imagined. I don't think I can beat him without a weapon. If I don't try to penetrate his armor, I can't do any damage to him. There is only one way, and it could be much worse: a bare-knuckle fight. But Igris noticed it, too, that I hid my blade, and began to look at me strangely. He seemed to understand. I want to fight with my bare hands, and in the meantime he was aiming his big sword straight into the ground and began to drop his cloak to the side. He was also willing to fight me with his bare hands, though he was a terrible knight, but he was fair. He decided to show me nobility by fighting me as an equal, too. He underestimates me, but at the same moment he started running straight at me with the purpose of destroying me. He turned out to be pretty fast, and in an instant he was already near me and hit me right in the chest. I hesitated from the blow, and at that moment he grabbed me by my clothes and threw me into the nearest wall, which I broke through. I was stunned by the sheer force he displayed in a split second, but that was only the beginning, and at the same moment he ran up to me and hit me again with all his strength. I was able to block that blow somehow, but eventually our environment collapsed completely, and debris began to fly around me. The air in the room was polluted with dust from that blow. Because I was able to somehow block his blow with my hands, I was able to bounce to the side. I blocked that punch, but I felt like I lost about half my life. If it wasn't for the armor that time, I wouldn't have survived if I had continued to take direct hits. He remained surprisingly strong even without his sword, and I began to question whether I could even stand up to this monster with dignity. Even if I lose in strength, I have to rely on speed, and I began to activate my sprint skill. The speed of my movement increased by 30%. I became too fast and approached him. At the same moment he elbowed me right in the head. I managed to put my arm up in time to block his blow. His arm bounced to the side, and at that same moment we fought furiously. Our blows were so fast that it was impossible for an observer to see even one straight punch. Because I was too tired and exhausted after the battle with the knights, I underestimated my capabilities. He hit me with such force that I started spinning in the air, and at the same time my health dropped below 30%. At the same moment my fortitude skill was activated, and the damage I received was reduced by 50%. If my defense increased in conjunction with my passive skill, I still had a chance. I couldn't give up in flight, and I was able to strike him in the head. But soon after, I saw his gaze pointing directly at me, and he got even angrier. He grabbed my leg with his hand and hit me with such force that I instantly flew aside. I hadn't expected that at all. After all, I thought I could somehow get through some more time and come up with a plan. But as soon as I started flying into the nearest wall and made a big hole in it, I started to come to my senses and realized that I was sitting on that throne in this room. And from that impact, I was thrown right across the room. I was sitting there opening the pancake and I started bleeding. At the same moment, Igris realized that it was over, and as he approached me, he raised his big hand to give me one last blow, after which I would no longer be able to stand on my own feet. Somehow he began to summon his sword, which was nearby, shredding the ground. The sword instantly flew straight into his hand, which he raised, and he swung it, pointing it straight at my neck to deliver one last blow. If I had hesitated for a second, he would have ended our fight. But I managed to block his blow with my hand. After all, I still had one more item, the Gauntlet of the High Knight, which gave me 3% physical damage absorption and had the added effect of preventing rock injury if my strength was less than 80. As a result, my movement speed was reduced. There was a big wave around us that raised all the dust in the air, and I started with my other hand. After all, I hadn't lost yet. And as soon as my blade was in my hand, I stabbed it right in the head. Igris rolled to the side after my blow, and at that moment I picked him up and started running straight with him to the other side. For in that moment I realized that I could overpower him. I ran across the room with my blade, and suddenly crashed into the nearest wall. At the same time, Iris raised his hand to pull my blade from his helmet. I told him that I wouldn't let anyone touch my things, and even if my dagger was stolen, I could summon it back. At last I could deliver one last crushing blow. I thrust my blade in one more time, and though it didn't feel like enough, I realized that I needed a little more and it would be over. My Deathstroke skill was activated several times, and eventually, I hit him with all my might and looked him straight in the eye, for I wanted to finally wait for the moment when he let out his last breath before I beat him completely. And that moment finally arrived. Igris fell after my blows. And, finally, I saw the notification I had dreamed of. I finally killed the bloody red warlord Igris. And at that very moment my level went up. I was terribly exhausted, and I sat right beside him, watching to see if it was over for sure. I had finally won. It was really close, and I felt the impact of technique, skill, and experience. I was weaker in every aspect. It's pure luck that I was able to win. After all, any mistake could have cost me my life if my opponent is so strong that he can fight on a par with the hunters and have the same rank. But suddenly I saw that I had knocked out the snow, the ruler's touch, the leather pouch, and the stone. Coming back was a joyous moment, for I had won as many as 4 awards at a time, and to me it was a well-deserved prize. Looking at it, you could tell that the risk was worth it. And when I opened the leather pouch, I found 1.5 million gold inside. I couldn't tell you how happy I was to have gotten it all in one go. I had never had that much gold before. To think, my gold had doubled in an instant. Also, I was able to get an item of rank S, unless you count the key to the gate of the demonic castle. This was the first time I had an S-rank piece of equipment in my hands, and the characteristics were also significantly different. Even a simple 15% increase in physical damage absorption would be a great boost, but adding 20 to my stamina and strength stats is incredible. And then there's the rune, and I was wondering what skill it contains. However, the skill can be gained by destroying the rune. There's also the return stone, which is a unique item to complete a quest. If you destroy the return stone, you can leave the dungeon instantly. If the skill change quest is completed in the dungeon, it will automatically be destroyed with no way to return. But I didn't understand why I was given the return stone, because it was definitely a room that opened in an instant. If the return stone had fallen out, it might have meant that the quest was not yet complete, and I would have many more battles to fight in order to change my profession. It didn't take long before I began to feel something appear near me. As soon as I turned my head to the right, I saw a portal appear beside me. I turned around and saw many portals appear near me. At that moment, I realized that the career change mission had begun. I already knew it couldn't be otherwise. The longer I last, the more points I can gain. The number of points determines how highly ranked a profession I get. And just as the time meter started going, I saw someone slowly start to exit the portals. I saw a bunch of knights coming out of the portals one by one. I realized that I could handle these guys even in my current state. If they were at Igris level, I wouldn't even be able to handle the first opponents. So the longer you last, the more points you gain. The probability of getting a hidden class increases with every second, and it's good enough to do the job of changing professions. I have 390 mana left, and using it requires 200 mana. I also have 190 mana units left to maintain invisibility. It also requires 1 life unit per second to maintain invisibility. This means that I can last in invisibility for 3 minutes, and I have enough health, HP. I will try to last as long as possible. A mage appeared out of nowhere and started using the detection skill, and at the same moment he was able to find me, even when I was in my invisibility skill. That's when I knew I was in trouble. All the knights that were near me started to notice me and attack, but I bounced to the side and hit them from behind, which made them start flying in different directions. Corrected text: as soon as they flew off to the side, I stood up to my full height, turned around, at which point my blood activated, reducing the target's stats by 50% for 1 minute. My bloodlust consumes 100 mana. It's my only chance, I have to give it my all for the duration of the skill. But there were too many enemies, and they were coming right at me. There were so many that they couldn't get through the corridor properly, and they were all pushing against each other. At the end of the corridor, a terrible battle broke out. And eventually, I started taking damage and my HP started decreasing. Because they were coming from the gate faster than I had time to deal with them, and my passive skill Fortitude was activated. But it wasn't enough. After all, I'd taken it too lightly and wasted too much mana on invisibility. And at this rate I wouldn't be able to use the skills anytime soon. I wondered if it was time for me to use the returning stone. And I'm not sure I'd get anything out of switching professions at my current level, it's too complicated. If I used the return stone, it would mean that I had failed the task. But as soon as I looked at the time, I saw that only 5 minutes had passed, and it looked like there was nothing left but for me to get out of this dungeon. But suddenly one of the knights hit me in the side with his huge hammer. I fell to the ground, and my return stone slipped from my hands and fell nearby. I lay on the ground and realized that my end might be near. All the knights who were nearby began to converge around me. But, still, I was able to get up and began to fight. I fought them off as best I could. Of course, in the end I decided there was no way it could have ended that way. Because such a priceless chance, all because, being at rock bottom, I dreamed of peaks. I, of all people, know what it means to be weak.